I considered naming this the disconnect of the delusional, because that's exactly what it is. It's a delusion that is only accomplished via a disconnect, which in turn allows us to tell ourselves lies to continue with our delusions. Unfortunately, those same lies are the lies that hurt nature. Over the years, anytime that I post footage that inarguably shows the goats prioritizing consuming native plants over the weeds that they're supposed to be getting rid of, those who are dedicated to the grazing program for whatever reason simply take a new escape route. And one of the most common ones is to say, well, they'll be fine. The plants will be fine. They'll grow back. No serious harm done. And whether this is true or not, the most important thing, or at least the first thing to consider, is that until this was pointed out to you, it wasn't even a consideration, and you simply looked for a new way to defend it. This leads to the other thought, or I should say lack of thought, which is that no one is considering how this affects the wildlife. Because even if it's true that these plants will recover or grow back, you're not considering what life is like for the other organisms that depend on those plants to exist and be healthy in the meantime. And I've been at this long enough that I have documented how long it takes for plants to recover, if they recover at all, and it's nearly the entire year. So you're talking about organisms that evolutionarily were accustomed to having these plants there for their benefit to use, whether it be for shade, whether it be for protective shelter, whether it be for nutrition, whether it be for nest building, anything. The list goes on and on and on. Only how long you're willing to look into how important these plants are to organisms will limit the number of reasons those plants should still be there. And I go back to the fact that you didn't even think about it. That says a lot about the human species, that we are so disconnected from nature that it didn't even occur to you to consider what value those plants had to the organisms that are still trying to survive in an already incredibly depleted habitat. I think about the rabbits that I scare. I don't want to scare them. There's not that much vegetation for them to hide in the first place. A lot of times they're just trying to rest in the heat of the day, or depending on the time of year, maybe they're trying to hide from the cold. But after the goats come through, there's almost no tall grass or vegetation for anything to hide in. And the clusters that the goats left behind for whatever reason, then when I go out into those fields and scare up a rabbit or another creature, I feel extra bad because there's almost nowhere left for these animals to hide. That's just one example. Another thought on birds. I know I mentioned other animals that spend time on the ground and try to hide in the vegetation, but I'm not sure many people realize how much time birds spend on the ground. Sure, in retrospect, you're like, yeah, well, of course they do. But I'm willing to bet most of us imagine birds up in the branches of trees. Reality is, I see birds foraging on the ground and doing other things a lot. And this really sunk in when I was walking through an area that didn't get grazed, and I scared up all these birds. I had no idea that they were there because there was vegetation for them to hide in. Now, the fear of fire, fuel mitigation, vegetation management, etc. has been drilled into your head so deep that you think this is a good thing. It's not natural. A mowed down landscape of nothingness is not habitat. Invasive plants are the wrong habitat. Invasive annuals are fire fuel. But the problem of these plants being fire fuel is based on agricultural animals in the first place. There are supposed to be grasses out there. There are supposed to be shrubs out there. But they're supposed to be the perennial, drought-resistant, native grasses and shrubs. Not the garbage that this very industry replaced all of that with. Now, if the bottom line is that you don't care as long as you feel safer from the threat of wildfires, then just say so. Get rid of all this horse crap about helping the habitat and just call it what it is. You don't care about nature as long as you get to live in an illusion that these goats are protecting you from the very problem that they are spreading. But there's an entire new direction to go with in this debate. And it's the shocking double standard that when livestock damage native plants, it's acceptable as part of the bigger picture. Yet I go online and find things that tell you that you need to control wildlife because of the damage that they do to trees and other native plants. Deer control, squirrel control. I mean, this is posted, unfortunately, from official agencies, forestry departments, etc. Humans always think that somehow they know better than nature did and come through to manage things. That's dumb enough by itself and egotistical enough in itself to be full of issues, but the fact that you've decided that livestock are allowed to do what you won't allow wildlife to do puts this absurdity on a whole new level. Just to put things into perspective, let's go down a list of considerations that frankly weren't considered. This being a drought state, simultaneously suffering increased intense heat conditions. I've got to mention the water. On the rare occasion that any of these riparian areas actually still have any water, well, guess what? When 500 goats show up, that changes. You know, between the sedimentation, the erosion, the trampling of the banks, causing all that dirt to go down into the water, and 500 livestock animals drinking water, let me tell you something. That's the end of what little water there was. As long as we're talking about temperature. Number 2, plants growing in those riparian areas. They also serve a purpose of growing their foliage over that water to help keep the water at a low temperature by blocking it from direct sunlight, which in turn positively affects organisms that are trying to live in that same water. Bearing in mind these organisms that I've just mentioned and the fact that there's hardly any water to begin with, you need to think about the fact that many of these organisms are burrowing into the ground just in order to survive, hoping, waiting for the next occasion of rain or some other sort of water. In the meantime, they have to hide from the dryness, from the heat, etc. And they will emerge at some point in the future, unless, of course, 500 hooved animals trample them to death. For those of you who want to flip that on its side and say, oh, well, deer and other animals trample too. No, not even close, not even comparable. Yes, they both have hooves. That's where the similarities end. If you don't know the difference, we've got to send you back to the beginning level of ecology. How about propagation? Has anyone considered that consuming a plant in the middle of its growth process might interfere with some other growth processes? I don't care if the plant does manage to come back the next year. Guess what stage it'll be at that time next year? Where it was before the goats trampled or consumed it. In the meantime, what that plant failed to do was get bigger, mature, flower, produce possibly berries or nuts that might benefit the native habitat, or its own seeds for propagation of the species. The goats cut all of that out of the equation, and you didn't even think about it. I mean, what I just said in those few seconds by itself is enough to make unleashing livestock on nature ludicrous, and you didn't even think about it. Again, sadly, I have to acknowledge that many people will react to what I just said and say, I'm fine with it. As long as there's less vegetation, I'm going to feel better. Hey, at least we cut through one layer of the bullshit and we can stop pretending like you care about nature. Directly tied to propagation is pollen. pollination? How about the flowers? How about the pollinators? How about the beneficial insects, the native insects that we supposedly are so concerned are on extinction's door, but won't do anything to change our behavior to help them? Everybody going out of the stores is buying non-native, even invasive plants, and it's difficult to find native plants being carried in these home improvement stores. Hell, finding a native plant nursery is difficult enough in itself. For the few native plants that are surviving, when they finally have a chance to flower, guess what gets to eat those flowers? Goats. And because of the broad range of species and the different times of year that they flower, I'm witnessing this for myself. You've got the annuals that will flower earlier in the spring, but I'm seeing a lot of species that aren't flowering until now, late September, which, at least in this particular location, is when the goats arrive. Whether we're talking about a butterfly, a moth, a hummingbird, a bee, etc., 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 none of it takes place. All of nature's intricate relationships are simply extinguished. Whatever complex design Mother Nature or God or whoever you want to give credit to, whatever the niche of these organisms was, just forget about it. Because, you know what? Let's feed it to livestock. Shelter, exposure, even if you don't think everything already listed was important enough to justify the existence of foliage, how about shelter? How about hiding? I personally can relate to this. In fact, I just talked about it while I was out there this morning. Soon, I won't be able to hide anymore. Just like the animals won't be able to hide anymore. I don't want humans seeing me out there doing my work. Don't want it. Even if they were to come up to me and say, great job, don't want it. I don't want to be seen. I don't want to be bothered. I don't want my project to be hindered. And I am all of a sudden going to be exposed because the goats are going to turn that woodland into a cemetery. That is not habitat. If I, as a Homo sapien, feel exposed, you can only imagine what wildlife feel like. And we have the nerve to turn around and call it habitat? Hell, we have the nerve to say that these goats are improving habitat, but the best thing you can say in response to me showing that the goats are in fact destroying the habitat is that the habitat will recover. Okay, so is it a benefit to the habitat, or is it a test to see whether or not nature can come back from the bad things that we do to it? Because those are very different. And someone posted what's going to end up being a legendarily terrible, stupid comment, mentioned goats in the same sentence as water and sunlight in terms of tools to be used. And of course, this person is an animal agriculture disciple, as evidenced by their profile picture. The disconnect from reality is crazy. Water, sun, and livestock, which humans created. God created the sun and the water. Humans created the livestock. And then humans dropped the livestock on native habitat, declaring that it's a good thing. And when confronted on the matter, have nothing better to say than, well, they'll come back. Can we also acknowledge that if you're going to justify the destruction of native plants by saying that the native plants will come back, that applies doubly to the invasive plants? Because that's exactly why they are there dominating, because of their ability to come back. And that's why it gets worse every year. The goats hurt the native plants, and the invasive plants take advantage of it. Food, nutrition of some sort. Like I said, most of these areas are dominated by non-native plants that the wildlife really don't seem to want anything to do with. You know, they're not consuming these plants, which is a big problem because obviously nothing is competing against these plants to keep them in check, which actually leads me to another subtopic. And every time that goats or human machinery or whatever kill a native plant, that takes away an ally that helps deter the increase of these invasive plants. You need something holding the territory to keep the enemy from advancing. You bring in these things that actually destroy the very things that are holding the front, and then wonder why things get worse the next year. So back to the food. Okay, so you have the foliage itself that can be consumed. You have berries that never have a chance to even grow. You have flower petals. You have pollen. You have nuts of various kinds. All of these things are food sources that never come into existence. And you wonder why wildlife are struggling? I almost left insects off of that list. Yes, insects are attracted to these plants, and these insects attract other animals that eat the insects. And yes, sometimes the insects eat a little bit of the plants. Guess what? It's supposed to happen. Don't apply your monocultured insecticide approach to your garden to nature. Speaking of wildlife struggling, I see fewer specimens of wildlife every single year. So don't tell me that things are getting better. Oh, we'll prove it. I tell you what, how about you prove that I'm wrong? How about the people in charge of the forestry, or urban forestry, or open spaces, or areas that municipalities have declared wildlife habitat? How about if you show me their studies that they're keeping track of the wildlife numbers? How about instead of putting everything on me, an amateur, just a citizen, trying to wake people up to what's happening, where are the actual experts at? Where's the official data from people you're supposed to be able to trust? Does not exist because nobody's recording such data, because nobody actually gives a shit about the wildlife. It's all a facade. Just like you people who come on and pretend that everything's fine because the native plants will, quote unquote, grow back. When in fact, you never even thought about it before you came up with that miserable excuse in the first place. Wildlife displacement, the next topic. I don't care if we still had gigantic grizzly bears living here. You send 500 of anything through an area and you're going to displace the animal. Now, in this case, the biggest thing we have left is a coyote, which is pathetic. Okay, a deer is bigger than a coyote. So the biggest predator left in most of these areas is a coyote. And then the biggest herbivore left is a deer. Everything else is a rodent or a bird or something of that nature. And guess what? They're gone. If I can disturb the wildlife, and let me tell you something, I have greatly improved my presence. I move much more quietly and am a lot less suspicious looking, if I may put it that way, to the wildlife. If even I disturb wildlife, let me tell you something. 500 blundering livestock animals bleeding and trampling and ripping down trees so that they can eat every last possible bit of native foliage, they're gonna disturb the wildlife and displace them. I can only imagine how many dens have been trampled or collapsed. I can only imagine how many nests hiding inside of foliage were destroyed, if not even consumed. How about the smell? You know, you'll go and watch a Nature Channel documentary that tells you about the importance of scent out in nature, how animals communicate with these very intricate odors that they produce, how they communicate with each other with odors, how they're attracted to an area because of odors, how they find a plant or another creature because of odors, how they mark territory with odors. And then you're going to turn around and pretend that the fecal matter of 500 non-native animals that isn't sparsely here and there, it's an absolute complete blanket of the land. Stinky, non-native animal poop covering the entire area. But because it's livestock shit, it's fine. So just throw everything that you learned on that nature channel out the window, because as long as it's livestock, it's fine. That's not going to affect the animals. They don't care about that smell. Listen, that smell, trust me, I grew up in ag land where I knew which way the wind was blowing because I could smell cow shit or pig shit depending upon it. I knew the smell. It's not like it's revolting or offensive to me just because it's poop. But let me tell you something, I don't smell wildlife poop. Even when I put my nose down next to it, I don't smell wildlife poop. Livestock come through, I can smell it before I'm within 100 yards. And again, I'm not saying that to complain about it. I am pointing out that all poop is not created equal. How much more powerful do you think that smell is to wildlife than it is to me? Speaking of the poop and it being unnatural, it doesn't go away. It's weird. It's one of the weirdest things. It just stays. You know, I'll be out there 8 months later and the goat shit is still laying where it was before. Never, ever, ever does that happen with wildlife poop. Whether other animals decide that they want to eat other animals' poop, whether or not plants use it, whether or not decomposers go after it, whether or not it's water or the sun or the wind or anything else that affects it, somehow the goat poop stays. I mean, why don't decomposers work on goat poop? That's pretty weird. Going back to this Forestry Commission report that I mentioned earlier, in which you're actually supposed to report when wildlife are being mean to plants, as if it's so unnatural for deer to rub their antlers on a tree or to nibble on leaves, etc., etc. What this reminds me of is yet another example. It probably deserves its own episode, but I'll mention it briefly. When the Urban Forestry Department, Parks Department, etc. decide to plant their own trees or other types of plants, well, guess what happens during goat grazing season? Those areas are protected from the goats. If they do any vegetation management, it is done with weed whackers so that the humans can carefully avoid hurting the plants that were planted by the human beings. I thought the goats didn't hurt the plants. Won't it be fine? Aren't they going to grow back? You know, the hypocrisy is just unbelievable. How about people's yards? You know what? If goats are so great, why do we need to fence goats off from people's property? I tell you why. Because they will destroy your yard, your garden, your plants, starting with the most desirable ones and getting to whatever weeds you have in your yard last. I got to wrap this up. It's probably pointless for those who so eagerly want to defend something that they don't understand in the first place. I doubt if you listen to more than 10 seconds of this. So I'll just end with a final argument of, well, they have other places to go. The wildlife have this and that and the other thing. They'll be fine. They'll adapt. They'll move. Move where? Move where? If you think that there's plenty of wild space for wildlife to move to, you have your eyes wide shut. Human development closes in from every direction at an alarming rate. The tiny little corridors of open space, of riparian areas, etc., whatever happens to be spared where you live, are now fed to livestock rather than actually acting as wildlife habitat. While you simultaneously won't let the goats into the newly developed area with your carefully crafted landscape plants. But whatever abuse you want to throw at nature is perfectly acceptable. Just keep it out of your own neighborhood. And with that, I will come to an abrupt halt.